The games are underway and DraftKings is bringing you to the podium. DraftKings' free-to-play pools are available every day of the games in Tokyo and offering a free shot at up to $50,000 in total cash prizes. That's up to $50,000 up for grabs, and the best part is that it is free to play. DraftKings free-to-play pools are easy to enter. Just download the DraftKings app, go to pools, and choose from a wide variety of free contests for an opportunity to win cash prizes. All you have to do is answer a handful of questions around what you think is going to happen during that day's events and track your results throughout the evening to see if you will achieve a victory. Questions will range from medal count to questions specific to the USA team. DraftKings is safe, secure, and reliable, so you can deposit and withdraw your money at your convenience. Download the top-rated DraftKings app now and use promo code TBPN when you sign up to get your free shot at up to $50,000 in total cash prizes every day of the games in Tokyo. Head to DraftKings Pools page to get your shot at huge cash prizes. That's promo code TBPN for a limited time only at DraftKings. Eligibility restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com for full details. You're listening to Spurscast, episode 622. My name is Paul Garcia, and I'm your host here on the Spurscast. Today I'll be joined by Project Spurs writer Collin Reid. In this episode, Collin and I will discuss the Spurs' draft selections, and then we'll preview free agency, which begins on Monday, August 2nd. Let's go ahead and get started here. Collin, how are you doing?
I am doing well. I am doing primo, as you may say.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be Josh Primo, who we're about to talk about. Yeah, that's good. I saw the HEB commercial, comps things are like things that work there. Not comps, but, like connections there. So,
right.
Yeah. So, yeah, as Collin just mentioned there, Spurscast, let's go ahead and review the draft, how it went on Thursday evening. Collin and I are recording this on a Friday afternoon. And yeah, I mean, the big word here is surprise with that 12th pick. The Spurs did select Josh Primo. It was a very surprising pick. He wasn't on our Project Spurs draft board. He wasn't supposed to go until the 28th pick. Instead, he goes at 12th. And, the earliest I saw in a mock was 24th at the earliest. Now, it wasn't just us, those of us that cover the Spurs and also the fans. And it was Josh Primo as well. He himself told us, we interviewed him in the media after the game. And I mean, not after the game, after the draft. And he said, he was very surprised. He didn't even believe his agent when he first told him you were drafted 12th to the Spurs. He just couldn't believe it. The Spurs GM, Brian Wright, did speak with us after making the selection. And he says that, they did explore trading down because, again, Primo was supposed to go late first round here. And he says they did explore trading down, also trading up. But being on the clock at 12th, he says they went with Primo. That was their best. That's who they best thought would work with their team. That's who they wanted. He also says that, a lot of people were making a lot of criticism toward the Spurs because, no mocks really had him in this range at 12th. And so he basically said, Brian Wright, the GM, that, the intel a lot of times doesn't match the intel that the teams get from these players. On these players, it does not match the mocks a lot of times, and so they went with that direction. They went more so what their intel said. They were happy. He used the word excited. Lonnie Walker IV was on a interview with NBA TV, and he says, the Spurs front office is raving about Josh Primo. So they, from their front office perspective, they were willing to take that risk and go basically like 16 positions higher in the draft. And there's been a lot of outrage. Spurs fans have not been very happy. There's been a lot of them. The comments are blowing up. They're asking for questions of the GM and all these different things. And then even like some draft analysts, none of them, obviously, if they're making the mock drafts, they didn't see Primo going this high. So a lot of them are not giving the Spurs very favorable grades on this pick. So before we get into who he is as a player, and even before, I talk about why the Spurs picked him, Collin, what were your just initial thoughts on them taking Primo at 12?
So I am willing to be critical of the Spurs front office when I disagree with them, and I can see the disaster potential here, right? Like, this pick could be terrible. What I will say in terms of holding evaluation back for a bit is that the Spurs are really only going to get and I'm very hesitant to use this word, especially considering the feelings with fans right now about Josh Primo. But the Spurs are only going to get their next like superstar best player on a championship level team, or even second best player on a championship level team, through the draft realistically. Like maybe they can do it through a trade, but like with the Pelicans in their draft assets, with the Thunder in their draft assets, with the Rockets in their draft assets, there's always going to be a team out there with better assets than the Spurs. So the Spurs are really going to need it through the draft. And like drafting another high production role player, but still wouldn't be the second or best team on the NBA, or like on an NBA championship team, isn't going to get them any closer. Like they have like 5 of those, and there's a couple players who are looking like they're developing further. But when you look at his strengths, and like what his like very, very high outcome is, which I know we'll talk about, you can see why the Spurs were intrigued here. You know, shooting, long, good instincts, you know, hints of playmaking that could get better. And you know, if Jokic was drafted number 12 by the Nuggets, that would have been a terrible draft night for them, right? Until all of a sudden he's the MVP of the league. So it's one of those things where projecting how well college players are going to play is very, very difficult outside of maybe the top 5 players in any class. You know, the top 5 players, you know, draft boards are pretty good at getting those right. We just ran an article yesterday about how bad historically the number 12 pick usually is. So like it's one of those things where could they have drafted a player who would have been a good role player and they almost had certainty in that? Sure, but the Spurs just really don't need another one of those. They need to take these home run chances, and if it fails, it fails, but they aren't getting any closer to a championship with another role player on their roster. So will Josh Primo ever become that? There's a low chance, but you know, it's better to take these home run swings than just draft more and more role players and I mean, I guess get up to the 6th seed someday. You know, so I see the logic behind it. I don't like the idea that, well, we wanted to trade down to get him, but he was here, so he drafted him way higher anyway. Like, that is kind of bad process, but I still at least see the process, and I think that that's being ignored right now.
Yeah, so now let's talk about a little bit, you know, you kind of talked about, you know, who he is as a player. He's a 6'6" shooting guard from Alabama. He was right now, you know, he did shoot 38% in college, but right now, you know, if you're a 38% shooter at the college line, then that doesn't project to be a good shooter right away in year 1 of the NBA. So that's kind of, I think that, you know, that number is not going to quite, you know, carry over to the NBA. I think he's going to struggle a little bit with his accuracy. He says that he's a switchable defender. You know, 1 through 3, you mentioned how he's long, he's got some versatility. He himself says he wants to improve on his rebounding, getting more physical, and then also on his playmaking. And that's a big key, is that, you know, Brian Wright says that basically the reason why they took him is just because of the upside they see in him, that he has a very high ceiling, and especially at his age. He's the youngest player in this draft. So some notes that Wright mentioned was that basically if you look at him, he's like, it was like he was playing, he was like a senior in high school playing in the SEC with Alabama. So he was already getting like real minutes at the college level, and really he should be at the age of a senior. And then also they really liked what they saw at the combine. You know, at Alabama, he says, Brian Wright, that they really kept him as a spot up shooter on that team, and they didn't think he could do more with the ball in his hands. Well, when he went to the combine, they put the ball in his hands, and he showed a lot of playmaking ability, and so that's what they're very intrigued by. What else do we have here? So also, you know, what is he does project to be a role player down the road. Different NBA player comparisons are Terrence Ross, I've seen, Karis LeVert, and Anthony Simons. So again, if you're going to talk about like a role player kind of player, then this is where he projects like a ceiling. But they hope that, you know, he has some star potential down the line, you know, and especially because he's so young and they get to start developing him now. You know, as far as his outlook for next season, he's probably not going to have a big role. You know, most likely he's going to get some time in Austin, or if the Spurs can't bring back Patty Mills, and then hey, maybe there's a chance to compete with some of those guards like Trey Jones for some minutes in the backup role, and so yeah, so I mean it's definitely a long-term play. One thing you can notice is like if you just look at his 4-year scale extension, right? I mean his 4-year contract, he's only going to be 23 by the time he gets ready to be extension eligible, and so you know you have basically him in the NBA now, seeing if you can develop him past being better than just a Terrence Ross or a Karis LeVert or Anthony Simons. So I think again it's a very it's a risky move, because I think that one part of it, you know, it's not his fault, but there's going to be pressure on him, unfortunately, because, he was taken, 16 positions ahead of where he should have gone. And there's always going to be those players that went after him. And, and they should have been in that 12 spot on these different mocks. So I think that there's some pressure. Now, Collin, my question for you, though, is, do we think that this might have some impact on Lonnie Walker? And the reason why I bring that up is because Lonnie's also a shooting guard. He has an interesting offseason coming up because the Spurs can extend him on a new deal before the start of the regular season. If they don't do that, well, then he becomes a restricted free agent next offseason, so they could lose him. So so I guess what are some of your thoughts on some of the background I gave you on him, but then also how this might impact the Spurs with Lonnie Walker?
So, a player who is kind of maybe far away from being a contributor, I also understand why that's not super exciting for the Spurs fans out there. But I would say, in the past, when you have a player like Forbes, who really wasn't a playmaker, he was really just a spot-up shooter. That was his role. He was all about shooting. But they sent him down to the G League and kind of ran things through him and tried to teach him how to run the pick and roll as a playmaker and all that kind of stuff. And he was able to kind of get there a little bit ish, but having a player who already kind of has some playmaking tendencies, it really just makes a ton of sense to send him to Austin and let a lot of the offense go through him. That's going to be the best place for him to develop. And I think that just based on the skills that he could develop based on the tools that are there, Austin is really, really a great situation for him, and it might be a year or it might be 2 years. Yeah. But I think that if he can in year 3 come and be Karis LeVert with flashes of, that playmaking being a little bit better or the shooting being really good, then all of a sudden you have a play on your hands that you're happy that you got at 12. But it is one of those things where we won't know the answer to that until, maybe 2023 or 2024. So it's hard because it could look like a great pick then, but that's just 2 years, and it's hard for people, I think, to project out that far. And, another draft pick who happened very recently who's similar is Luka Samanic, right? We knew that he was raw coming in, and we knew that it would take a couple years for those skills to develop. So it just can be hard, I think, for people to project out it looks like a weird pick now, but it might be a good pick in 2 years. And that it's just hard to think that way. What I'll say about Lonnie is just that because Primo is so far away from contributing in terms of maybe a season or two, I personally wouldn't like the Spurs to make a decision on Lonnie based on Primo alone. However, my hunch would be that they don't offer him an extension and they just kind of let the season play out. If they do that and all of a sudden he has a great season, well, they have match rights basically. But if he kind of has a season that he has been having, I think it's going to be kind of the Kyle Anderson thing where they see if someone throws a big offer or a big contract at him, and they decide whether or not they want to match it. And if they don't match it, they say, we're happy for you that you got this contract, but we're going to let you go play somewhere else. I think it's very, very similar to the Kyle Anderson situation at this point.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, and we'll get and further on because Lonnie has up until the first day of the regular season to get that extension. We'll explore that a little bit later on in the offseason. All right, now let's look at the next player that the Spurs chose with their second round pick, the 41st pick, and this is Joe Wieskamp. He's had several years in college, so he's more of a ready player, ready to play right now. He's not as raw as Primo, and so he was right in that correct projection range. Our Project Spurs draft board had him going 43rd, so it's right there. 41, 43. He's right there where he should have been. He's a 6'6" shooting guard / small forward who can really shoot the ball and spread the floor for you. He was in this draft class, he was one of the top shooters from 3, and because of how well his accuracy percentage is, his percentage translates to saying, yes, this is going to be a guy who can make the NBA 3 right away at a pretty good consistent level. His NBA player comps on different sites are Duncan Robinson, Kevin Huerter, Luke Kennard, Aaron Nesmith. Now you might ask, why was he a second round pick? Well, it's because of the defense. He really that's the one knock on him is his defense. He admitted that. We interviewed him after he got drafted, and he basically said, defense is his one knock, and he definitely wants to improve on that. So that's probably one of the key reasons why he's so far down, fell to 41. But again, this guy can shoot, and this is a team coming back right now. When we don't talk about the free agents that doesn't have a lot of shooting. I just looked at the roster, and I had tweeted this earlier. I just said, some of the he would already be one of the top 4 shooters on this team when you have Derek White, Lonnie Walker. There's another guy. I forgot who it was. Oh, Devin Vassell, and then like Wieskamp might literally be their fourth best shooter in terms of volume and also accuracy just coming into this roster. Now, something to keep in mind though is that yes, he is a second round pick, so we got to see if the Spurs will even sign him to a deal. And the reason why I say that is because they have a different track record with second round picks. They could go the option of Trey Jones, what they did last year, where they gave him basically an NBA contract for the minimum amount because they have all this cap space, and basically get him on 1 to 3 or 4 year deal. It's up to them. Or they could even just make him a two-way contract player, which means he's going to spend some time in Austin or come up to the NBA level like they recently did with Quindary Weatherspoon. So it's not guaranteed though that he'll be on the roster, although because of the direction this franchise is going with the youth movement, I think that he will. And then I as opposed to Primo, I really feel like Wieskamp has a chance of getting some minutes. If this team's struggling to space the floor, Pop could right away just bring him in and he brings you real quick shooting to spread the floor for your team. So what are some of your thoughts on them taking Wieskamp with the 41st pick?
I think that is a great pick. I do also appreciate that, like in this draft and in the past draft, the Spurs have been focusing on players who are either good shooters or can develop at shooting. Like I'm glad that we see that they're focusing on shooting after us not quite being sure if they knew that the 3-point line existed for a while. But I do think this is definitely the kind of player type where if he can come in and shoot right away, like he can get minutes right away. And in the NBA, one-on-one defense does matter, but if he can get his like team rotation defense to the point of, and I'm going to be honest, I've never watched film on this guy. I don't know kind of where his level is at right now. But if he can just get his defense to the point where it's okay enough that he doesn't get played off the floor, then his shooting will almost like certainly have positive value. And that's just such a good thing to get with the 41st pick. So I guess to me, not really having watched him play much, it really does come down to where is the defense and how good can he improve that to at least be to the point where he's not getting played off the floor because teams are attacking him. If he can get to that point where he can stay on the floor and even, hopefully maybe to the point where he can stay on the floor in important minutes as a shooter to space the floor, then all of a sudden he does become a really valuable player, and getting that with the 41st pick is awesome. And my preference would be the Trey Jones style thing rather than the two-way, just because we're going back to the way that it was before, where two-ways can't play in the playoffs unless you convert them to full contracts.
Oh, okay.
And if his shooting is like as advertised and he is able to provide use to the team, then I think that they should, rather than have to waive someone to sign him to a full contract for a potential playoff run, they should just have him on a full contract to begin with, especially if his shooting is as advertised and he can get his defense a little better. That just seems like a better roster fit for me.
Yeah, and I just feel one other thing is, again, like on paper, what I'm seeing right now, I would say that yes, this guy's going to get might even be able to fight for a rotation spot. And I think also get a minimum contract with the Spurs. But I think one thing that's important is that we are going to get to see him play against not start real NBA quality talent that's on an 82 game season. We're going to see him play in the summer league. We're going to see Wieskamp and Primo both play in the Utah summer league and the Las Vegas summer league with the Spurs. GM Brian Wright did say they would both be participating. So this is going to be our first chance, and if it just I think it's like a week or two away the summer league start, so we're going to get to see our chance exactly how these players stack up against NBA level talent right away, and the floor design at the NBA level. So I think that's something interesting to watch, and I'll have a better opinion on Wieskamp after I see him play a few summer league games and see how he stacks up against NBA competition. So yeah, I mean that's a cool thing to see, and so those are the two picks. Obviously, I think it's going to be a wait and see on the Primo one. I know right now a lot of fans are very disappointed and upset about that pick. And again, we'll just have to kind of wait and see. And I would say one thing, I mean, this is a stretch though to go that far from 28 to 12, is that the Spurs, they kind of get the benefit of the doubt a little bit just because they have been drafting so well. I think their last one, the only player that they really didn't have a good draft for was Nikola Milutinov in 2015, only because he didn't come to the NBA. He really hasn't made it, and I don't think he will come to the NBA. But the players they've been taking with their first round picks lately, maybe also aside from Samanic, but again, we're kind of waiting to see because he hasn't had a chance to play. They've been able to turn these guys into good quality players. Now, obviously not all-star level players, but good quality role players like you mentioned, Collin. So again, it's going to be a wait and see with Primo, and and again, it could be more than just his 4-year deal. It could just be going even further before they think that we really see what he turns into. All right, so now, before we jump into free agency here, I want to begin by looking at the team breakdown of where they stand right now heading into free agency, starting on Monday, August 2nd. So I want to explore first, Collin, are the players on guaranteed contracts and then some decisions, and then we'll look at who the Spurs free agents are. So guaranteed players coming back right now, barring a trade, would be from the starting lineup, DeJounte Murray, Derek White, Keldon Johnson, and Jakob Poeltl. players coming off the bench on guaranteed contracts are Trey Jones, Lonnie Walker the fourth, Devin Vassell, Lucas Shamanic, and then Drew Eubanks. Now he's on a non-guaranteed contract, but they're most likely going to guarantee it, so I'm just putting him in that guaranteed group. Then we have Josh Primo once he signs his rookie contract, and I'm assuming they'll sign Joe Wieskamp to a Trey Jones type contract, so he'll be on the roster. So what does that mean? That means if all these players are on the roster, as free agency starts, that's 11 players on your roster, and you only have 4 open roster spots. Plus, you have 2 two-way. But again, the key here is with free agency is the 4 open roster spots. Now, they do have a decision to make coming up soon on Sunday, August 1st with DaQuan Jeffries. He has a team option for his contract. I think it's like $1.7 million. But they have to make a determination if they're going to keep him on the roster for next season, fully guaranteed, or if they're going to waive him. If they waive him, well, then they can make him restricted free agent, or they can just let him walk. Now, if they keep Jeffries, well, then all of a sudden, hey, your roster's crunch is even lower now. You have 12 players on guaranteed contracts, and then you have just 3 slots open to add free agents. So again, that's key. Now let's look at who's going to be heading into free agency. We have DeMar DeRozan, unrestricted free agent. Rudy Gay, unrestricted free agent. Patty Mills, unrestricted free agent. Trey Lyles, and Gorgie Jang and Quinndary Weatherspoon are also all unrestricted free agents. The only player they can make into turn into a restricted free agent is Keita Beats-Diop, though they haven't announced yet if they're going to do that, tender him a qualifying offer. And also, if they let all these free agents walk, well, then we know that they can create up to $49 million in cap space. So before we get into specific players, Collin, did you have any thoughts on the team breakdown just heading into free agency before we talk about individual players?
Yeah, it is interesting because you look at their free agents and you do expect, not a lot of that list is coming back, but it'd be incredibly surprising if none of that list comes back, And Jeffries was really a player brought in. I don't even know if he played a game with the Spurs.
He didn't. No, he didn't.
And he came in right at the end, and they really brought him in just to see, to get him into their system and to kind of get them into their, organization. And so I know he'll probably be there at training camp. I don't know if he'll be there at Summer League, but they'll have to make a decision on that, like you said, pretty dang quick without being able to really see much there. So
yes.
That's interesting. But even if they decline that option, you would expect them to bring 1 or 2 of their free agents back. And if they do that, all of a sudden they only have 2 or 3 roster spots open, which is really, really interesting when you think about how many needs they need to fill, but also how many good free agents are out there. And how much cap space they have.
Yeah, so it's exactly. It's almost like a roster crunch considering that they have so much money, to spend in free agency. So now let's go play, by a few of these free agents specifically. And I just want to get your thoughts on their situation and what you think. So let's first begin with the big free agent here. This is DeMar DeRozan. We've seen him before the Lakers made that trade for Russell Westbrook. There was a lot of interest between DeRozan and the Lakers, and he even went on the record in an interview with Shannon Sharp and said, he would be open to playing for the Lakers even if it meant maybe taking less money. But now that Russ is there, that probably rules out the Lakers as an option. So, there's been different teams with reported interest in him. There's the Spurs that there's been a report that they want to bring him back. There's the Bulls, the Chicago Bulls, the Clippers, the Washington Wizards, and also the New York Knicks. Now, the 2 teams that would need to actually use a sign and trade to bring in DeRozan would probably be the Clippers and the Wizards. So for them to sign DeRozan, it's very difficult. The Spurs need to get involved there with the 3 teams, to sign and trade. Now, the Spurs, obviously we know they have his bird rights. They have all this free agencies. All this cap space, so they can easily, bring him back if they wanted to, and he wanted to come back. Then we have the Bulls, who can open up a good amount of cap space for him. Might need to make a few trades just to get some more cap space. And then we have the Knicks, who have a lot of cap space. They actually have more than the Spurs, so they could easily just give DeRozan a contract outright. So, what are your thoughts on DeRozan? First of all, the fact that he could be signed to trade some of these teams, or what do you think?
Well, so I never even had thought about a sign and trade with the Clippers. But what's interesting is I know that at one time, I'm not sure where they stand on this now, but at one time the Spurs had interest in Marcus Morris. So I do know that, they have that to trade. But so that's interesting. And I know that because it's so easy to look at this as like an asset play, right? Like, if DeMar is going to leave, then we need to do a sign and trade to get something back for him is kind of where fans are at with that. But just like that roster crunch that you just mentioned, that 11 players or 12 players on roster wasn't including DeMar DeRozan. So if you sign and trade him, you're getting 1 or 2 players back. Like that crunch gets even worse. Like I do not think that DeMar DeRozan walking in free agency without a sign and trade is the end of the world for the Spurs. And in fact, it might make their offseason go a little bit easier, because better to be able to sign the free agents you want to sign than make a trade just to make it. And now your roster is really full of players that you're kind of ho-hum about just because you did it to get some assets back. Like they have $50 million in cap space. This is the time to go fill those 4 spots or 3 spots with free agents that they like, rather than players that they're kind of iffy about because that's where DeMar wanted to go. So to me, it's just, I think that him walking in free agency without a sign and trade, which is probably the most likely option at this point, really isn't the end of the world. And I kind of want to get that out there into the ethos, because I think that it's just become so much like the Spurs need to get something back for DeRozan, and I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, and so before you and I started recording, I was listening to a podcast on ESPN with Zach Lowe and Bobby Marks, and Zach Lowe mentioned that when he first heard about the chance, because DeRozan said in that interview about going to the Lakers that he does want to win, he wants to compete now. Now he's at that point in his career where he's ready to move on to a team that can compete for a championship at this point. But Zach Lowe mentioned that a few weeks ago he gauged what does he think that he has some I guess like front office people that what do you think the chances are that DeRozan comes back to the Spurs, or they had said like 90-10 he's leaving, but then now it's kind of dropped down to like 60-40. So, and then Bobby Marks made the case that really, like, if it's not the Knicks, he doesn't know who's actually going to throw that big offer at DeRozan, and so he could actually see a very likely scenario if the Spurs can't figure out the free agent that they want, and maybe DeRozan can't get the money that he wants, well then he could see another year or two of them just kind of re-signing together, working with each other again. So you're not ruling it out. And again, there was a report by Mark Spears of ESPN that yes, the Spurs are still interested in keeping him. So we'll see what happens. Brian Wright, the GM, was asked about that, in his press conference yesterday, and he basically just said, they're waiting for those conversations until they can actually start free agency. So right now, they haven't really had those conversations till it officially begins. So again, we'll kind of see with DeRozan. It's all over the place. He could leave. He could, right now, if I just had to just give my opinion against not my reporting, I would say the Knicks, just because it's easier. Zach Lowe also mentioned how they made some trades with their picks, so that way they could open up even more cap space. So I really feel like right now it would be the Knicks, but we'll see. I mean, what happens? So with DeRozan. All right, let's go to Rudy Gay. His contract projection, according to Profit X, is kind of like in that MLE range. There hasn't been a lot of noise about what he's deciding to do. If he wants to go compete for a championship, well, then we think that, a contender can probably give him a mid-level exception type deal. If the Spurs can't spend their cap space or find anyone to take, that they really want to use, they can just re-sign Rudy to a good deal to eat up some of that cap space for maybe like a one-year deal. What are your thoughts on Rudy?
I think that we've kind of seen a lot of big wings going to like these championship contenders for the MLE or the tax MLE, and I feel like that's kind of the trajectory that Rudy's on right now, just in terms of a team where he can contribute off the bench and spot like a matchup dependent guy, like very much like the Wes Matthews blueprint, really. And I know that the Wes Matthews didn't get used as much in LA as people thought that he might have going into the season, but I think that blueprint just makes too much sense for that not to be how this goes from here. So I would be surprised if the Spurs re-sign him, but I think he's going to be on a contender for, the tax MLE or the MLE and just kind of contribute in his, like, in limited spots, but kind of have a good role on a team like that.
I agree with you. I think that he's moving on, probably toward a playoff level team at this point. All right, let's go to Patty Mills. He's interesting because, we know that he has the background with the Spurs. He's been with this team for the majority of his career, aside from those first few years in Portland. He's a really part of the city, part of the culture of the team. He's a leader on the team. So we know that, there's just a lot of questions, whether or not they're gonna bring him back, because do they maybe bring him back like at an MLE type level, because we know that he's still playing well enough where he's projected to get about 10.9 million to 14 million out in free agency per Profit X. But then if he were to leave, well then not only does that put a lot of pressure on Trey Jones or even somebody like Josh Primo to have to step up and play a lot of minutes there at the backup point guard spot, but also the Spurs lose their top 3-point shooter. He's their best shooter in terms of volume and accuracy, so that's one of their go-to guys, and we've seen here, he's out in the Olympics right now with Australia, competing right now, and so we see that when he's given certain roles or his minutes aren't as much, and we know that he kind of struggled a little bit down the end of the stretch there, that he can still be an impactful player. What are your thoughts on Patty, whether or not they bring him back?
Yeah, I like, if I had to make a bet on this, I would say that they're going to re-sign Patty, and like in my personal opinion as well, I think they should. He is the best shooter on the team, and especially kind of in my eyes, he's the best spot up shooter on the team, which is in my eyes a very important thing, just because they need more players who can play off ball. They have several players who, with the ball in their hand, can get to the rim and who can kind of break down defenses that way. But they also need players who can stand like on the perimeter and be ready to hit an open shot once that player does that if they pass out to them. And Patty's the best example of that right now. So if they don't re-sign him, they're going to have to get that in free agency. And that's just like, why go out and get a player that you could just re-sign that's already on your own team? Because they're going to have to make up what they're losing from him in free agency. I know the grass is always greener. I know that Spurs fans know exactly who Patty Mills is, and so like the prospect of some of these free agents that are out there sounds more alluring, but it's not going to be. If the Spurs lose Patty and don't replace him, the shooting is going to just get worse on this team. And I do think, it's kind of hard to define how much does team chemistry matter? How much does leadership matter? And it's hard to define how much it does, but I think it does. And I think that Patty brings a lot of that to the team. So yeah, in terms of his shooting and that, I don't think they can make it back up.
Okay, yeah, and I kind of agree with you. I just feel like, yes, like they're gonna. I could see unless it's like a big contract that he really wants. I could see him returning. Just he's. I'm looking at Prophet X's career outlook model, and he's still projected to be an impact player, an impact starter, level bench player for these next two seasons. He's not going to be a starter, but what I mean is like the production he brings to a team is going to be that closer to the level of a starter. So yeah, for these next two seasons, despite him getting older, I still they project that he's still going to be a really good quality player. And so I think that that's what the Spurs could do, is maybe give him like a 2 to 3 year deal and see maybe maybe this season he continues to have his role, but maybe next season or the season after he starts to kind of like be more that mentor role as he gets to later toward the end of his career. So again, it wouldn't surprise me at all either if they re-sign Patty, but again, if it's for a lot more money, well then maybe they let him, he does choose to go elsewhere depending on who offers a contract. These next players, I'll just kind of say their names and you just kind of I'm gonna project now that they're leaving the team, that they're not going to re-sign it. This is Gorgie Jang, Trey Lyles, Akita Bates-Diop, and Quindary Weatherspoon, those 4 free agents. I don't see them coming back to San Antonio. What are your thoughts? Do you think either of them come back? I
would agree on all of that. I just think, each of them has contributed for the Spurs in different ways. The last two kind of maybe less so, but just we are talking about that roster crunch. If they do re-sign Patty, then all of a sudden they have 3 roster spots to do things with, and that just gets tough to operate. With their $50 million in space, they could upgrade over each of those players, I would say, with what's out there. It's not an amazing free agent class, but they can upgrade over at least the players you just mentioned.
Yeah, I agree with you. So again, we both think that those players are gone. All right, so now before we get into the specific free agents, I do have two more questions for you. The first one is, do you think that, let's just say that the Spurs aren't so high on this free agent class, or maybe that the players that they want, let's just say John Collins, right away Woj breaks that the Hawks and John Collins agree to a deal, so there's no chance of the Spurs to send an offer sheet. Now, if that happens, where like the free agents they really want are going to be off the board, or they don't think they have a realistic chance, do you see the Spurs as being one of those teams that can kind of take in bad contracts but get future draft assets? I know that Zach Lowe and Bobby Marks said they don't have a track record of doing this because they always want to be competitive as long as Pop's coaching them. But do you see them maybe looking at that scenario?
So I was actually thinking that it would be difficult for that same reason you just outlined, and also just because of the so if they start to rebuild now, they kind of have to blow up what they've been building with this young core. I think that like maybe Keldon and Devin and Luka are in spots where they could kind of keep them around, but I think that DeJounte and Derek are both kind of getting a little bit older to have a full-size rebuild where the players that are going to be important on this team aren't even drafted yet and might not even be in college yet. Yeah. So it's just like, I think they certainly can do that, but that kind of rebuild doesn't make quite as much sense for the Spurs. Now, I think that maybe they could take on a contract of a player who, and I don't have a good example, of course, right now, but a player who like, this player could be a contributor, but he's just probably not worth the contract, and do that kind of thing where they're not just taking on salary that's not going to do anything for them, but they're actually taking in a player who can contribute. It's just, overpaid on his current contract. And that might be kind of a best of both worlds scenario where there's a player that's helping them win now, just a little overpaid, but they're also getting some capital for taking that player on. I think that'd be the best construction of that deal. But if they're taking on like a player who's not going to get any playing helps with their current goals.
Okay, interesting. And then the last player I want to talk about before we get into the free agents is Ben Simmons. You and I talked. I think it was you and I a few weeks ago that when Philly was first looking to trading him, how the Spurs should maybe make a run at him. And so apparently they at least asked Philly, what would it take? Apparently, according to Zach Lowe, the Spurs did at least ask. And then Kevin O'Connor of the Ringer reported that Philly wanted a lot from the Spurs if they wanted Ben Simmons. They basically asked for a young player plus 4 future first round picks, and 3 pick swaps, which is very similar to the James Harden package to Brooklyn. That kind of a package is what they're looking at. And right now we know that the Spurs turned that down reportedly, and also every team's basically been turning that down. There's no one that's offering a James Harden-esque type of package. But what are your thoughts on the Spurs actually at least being interested in looking at Ben Simmons and trading for him?
I know that we discussed this last time we talked, but that makes a lot of sense because they do just need to get like that all-star level player on the team if they want to advance forward, and like this is their best opportunity to do so. Is that too high of a price? Absolutely. However, it's also the smart move for Morey to do this. Like, they are setting the price and they're going to come down. Like, no one's going to accept this value, obviously, but they're not going to let other teams define the market. They're going to start with this ludicrously high number, and then they're going to like slowly back it down over time until finally a team is going to be like, okay, you know what? This is still a lot, but I think we'll take a chance on it. And so I think they're actually handling this the right way by setting it so ludicrously high that no one's going to say it, but now they're completely in control of the market, and they're just going to slowly step it down as time goes on. I think it was good for the Spurs to be interested, and I think they should continue to be interested in it as the 76ers start stepping down what their asking price is.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm right there. At least it's good to see that the Spurs were interested. Obviously, that was a crazy package. In the future, we'll see. What if that package goes down. And something is, that Woj report is that Ben Simmons and his agent are working with the Sixers. Basically, they're working in step and looking to see what could be his new home in terms of a team to be traded to. All right, so again, those are some things to watch. Now let's go ahead and jump right into this free agent portion. And so the way I'm doing this is we're going to look at some of the comments that Brian Wright made post draft on what the team wants to add in the offseason. So one thing he said he wants to add is they want to add shooting to Spurs. They also want to get bigger and add versatility is key. He said he wants to have players that can play inside and out, not just be like one-dimensional type players, I guess. And then he also said he wants to solidify the front court. So with that in mind, I've looked at the free agency list that's coming up, and I've kind of put some free agents I think are realistic targets for the Spurs in different groups, and unrestricted free agents, restricted, and then also in the event that DeRozan does want to do a sign and trade with one of these teams. So that's kind of what I'm going to discuss. And then Collin, you can kind of give me your background on those thoughts, and then also if you had any specific free agents. But before we start this part, I do want to note that I'm going to use some contract projections from Profit X. So I want to make sure I give them credit and just let you know, Spurscasters, that Profit X is a dynamic financial and performance index powered by artificial intelligence with front office optics displaying 17 visual and time series models for 480 plus NBA athletes. The Athledex models historical, dynamic, and future performance data to monitor and project insights on contracts, performances, injuries, team fit, development, and potential. You can follow them on Twitter at ProfitXAI and also on Instagram. So now let's go ahead and jump into this. So some players, if we're just talking about adding shooting, I'm really looking for players that are younger than 30 because they want to fit that Spurs' timeline, and also players that are for. I'm looking for size. 6'7" and above in terms of these players out on the wing. And some of these players are a question on defense though compared to the others. So the first player I have is Kelly Oubre Jr., who it's been reported that the Spurs do have interest. Now the price tag for signing him is pretty high. It's $24.2 million according to Profit X. Collin, what would your thoughts be of them looking at Kelly Oubre Jr.?
I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of just kind of the player archetypes they're looking for. I will say in terms of shooting, I do think that he can be a little bit streaky. I know that he started the year very terribly, and that happens to all shooters, but I think he missed like 19 of his first 23s this season or something like that. But I do think that kind of what he provides in terms of both size and his skill set, I actually think is a very good fit on this team. And I think he's a very interesting player because the Warriors don't really have they could sign and trade him and maybe get an asset back, but they don't really have, because of their cap situation, have a way to make up his salary if he just leaves. So he's just a very interesting player to monitor. But I think, the Spurs are in the situation where they have enough cap space where they can throw kind of a bigger offer at a player like Kelly Oubre and bring him in. And I think his skills could help this team.
Okay, so interesting again, and again, it's been reported the Spurs do have interest. This next player is the contract's not too bad. He's going to give you some shooting, but I think that he's going to struggle a little bit on the defensive end. So I couldn't really see him starting. He'd have to be a player who comes off the bench. And this is Furkan Korkmaz, shooter off the bench. I think he's 6'7" out of Philly. His projection right now is $9 million. What do you think about Korkmaz?
I think that isn't a player that I know quite as well, but I do wonder if like he's a player just because. Part of the thing with the Sixers has always been they haven't had enough shooting around Joel Embiid. That's part of the problem with Simmons there. And I just feel like he fits well with what the 76ers are doing. So I think that they're going to prioritize signing him. But if the Spurs can convince him to leave, I do think that he would be a good option for kind of what you're saying, a rotation shooter player.
Okay. And then the last player in terms of this group here that I have is Otto Porter Jr. Now, I know that he hasn't looked great the last few years because he's been hobbled by injuries, and that's another risk, though, is that he's a very injury-prone player. But right now, because of the injuries, basically, you can get him his projection right now is $9.6 million, which that's not bad because he's 6'8". He's got the defensive tools where like I could see him starting with the Spurs at the 4, being able to guard guys like at least be a better matchup for guys like LeBron and Kawhi and all these other players compared to Keldon Johnson or Derek White or DeJounte Murray or even DeMar DeRozan when he was with the Spurs. So I see him more so as a better fit on the defensive end. He could play at the 4, like I mentioned. If he can get his 3-point shooting, he's also a little streaky. He's not as consistent as well. But if he can get back and get healthy, I feel like he'd be a good option, especially at $9.6 million. What do you think about Otto Porter Jr.?
No, I agree with that, and I think health is one of those things where a player can struggle with health for years and years, and then get into the right situation where a team there's so many things that go into that: rest, rehab, all of that kind of stuff. And there are certain teams that are just better at that kind of stuff. And also sometimes an environment might just be better for someone. So, if he can get into the Spurs organization and they are able to just kind of with their training program keep him healthier, he just kind of has better luck with that kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and then he can contribute at that position. Like what you said, starting at the 4, like that's really valuable for the Spurs right now because I think that kind of big forward wing kind of the part where the Venn diagram of like wing and forward overlaps. Yeah. That's where the Spurs are like really shallow in terms of talent, and that's where they really need to look at it, which I know is why you kind of started going after players like this. So I think, like if that health can hold up, like a player that would give them depth at that area is incredibly important to this team right now. For sure.
Did you have any players in that like that wing kind of play type that you were looking at?
Yeah. So in this, I was kind of looking back over my sheet as we were talking. So we had talked about Duncan Robinson a couple of times, which that one is kind of scary because I do think that the Heat are going to throw a big offer sheet at him. And I know that we talked about that too. But as I was looking through this again, I don't know if he would be interested in a reunion just because his skills help championship teams so much. But I mean, Danny Green is a free agent this offseason, and he'd fit very well on this team. And there are several players like that out there. But when I was kind of going through my list and kind of making a list of all of the free agents, it was interesting to me that Danny Green kind of stood out. And I think so. This player doesn't really, I don't think, fits this archetype especially well. But in terms of just kind of someone with size and can kind of do that in terms of give them a little bit more of that wing forwardy depth. The Grizzlies tried. Oh my gosh, let me look at my sheet here real quick. Justice Winslow. They traded for him, and it was going to be kind of a second draft thing. He was supposed to be this kind of point forward in Miami, but then Miami kind of accelerated their timeline with the signing of Butler and all that kind of stuff. So the Grizzlies gave up a lot for him, but then just kind of like you're talking about with Otto Porter Jr., very, very injured, couldn't find a way to get on the court with everything else going on. And I'd be interested if the Spurs could maybe do a third draft type of thing, and if he has more health, if he can kind of, like, they could buy low on him at this point and maybe bring him in, and maybe he could provide value over what would be expected just because these past couple of seasons have been so much lower than what his expected value was that he's in like a big buy low type of situation right now.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And he's going to be probably a unrestricted free agent because the Grizzlies are going to have to waive him to make that deal work with trading Valanciunas to the Pelicans for Eric Bledsoe and Steven, what's his name? Steven Adams. There you go. Mm-hmm. So he could definitely be available. Now I see Prophet X has his projection at let me see here, like 9.3 is like the MLE range, but I think that could be, the lower is like 6.9. So again, I that's a good shot. Maybe taking a gamble on a player like Winslow, because he's so young and has been unbothered by a lot of injuries in the past few years. Maybe that's interesting to look at. Let's go into that other part that Brian Wright said, the GM. He said, getting bigger with versatility is key. He wants players that can play inside and outside, also solidify the front court. So now let's look at some bigger players than just like 6'8". So if we're looking at unrestricted free agents, I really couldn't find a player aside from who kind of fits this model, except for like Kelly Olynyk. Now the problem though is he might get a good payday. He's projected to get about $20.5 million. I think that's a little bit too much if you're for the Spurs to send an offer to Kelly Olynyk. What do you think about Olynyk?
I like the skills that he brings on the offensive side. Not a huge fan on the defensive side, but if he can play next to Pirtle, I guess some of that's mitigated a little bit. It is an interesting fit from that perspective. And the Spurs just so desperately need shooting, and there's a lot of players who I'd be willing to overpay, but Kelly Olynyk at that 20 million mark is a little bit steep for me.
Okay, yeah, and I agree there too. And again, in terms of unrestricted free agents, that's the player that I could kind of find that kind of fits some of that model. When we talk about restricted free agents, then this gets interesting. Now, John Collins is obviously number one on the list, and the problem though is that the latest indications are that he's going to stay in Atlanta. Woj on the night of the draft said basically that right when free agency starts, Atlanta and John Collins are hoping to come together on an agreement. I've also read that he's happy with like a $27.5 million, which isn't quite the max, but at least it's happy that the Hawks, if they give that to him, he'd be willing to stay. And then there was just a report recently from Mark Stein today that you and I are recording this on a Friday that all indications to suitors of John Collins are that he's going to end up staying in Atlanta. So basically, don't even send your offer sheet at this point. So right now, it kind of looks from where things stand that John Collins is most likely going to be with the Hawks. So that takes him off the list most likely. And if that's the case, well, then there's two players left here that are very interesting. And again, they're both restricted. There's Jarrett Allen, who is projected to get about $23.4 million next season is his contract range. But all indications so far do seem like yes, the Cavs are going to keep him. And now we know that they might let him go because they took Evan Mobley in the draft number 3. But the problem there is that he doesn't quite fit exactly what the GM was talking about, the Spurs GM. He's not as versatile. Now we know he's a great defender, has a lot of athleticism. He's a good rim rolling type of big. So he does very similar some of the things on the offense and defensive end of what Jakob can do. But he doesn't do he doesn't bring you that versatility and like John Collins would have of being able to space the floor and put the ball on the floor and things like that. So that's where I'm a little bit interested about Allen. If they went after Allen, I almost think like a Pirtle trade will be coming down the road. What do you think? What are your thoughts on Allen?
Yeah, I think, and we talked about this earlier too, I think reasonable people can disagree on if Pirtle or Allen is a better player. I don't know if a reasonable discussion is that the Spurs would, for what the Spurs would need to pay Jarrett Allen to get him out of the Cavs organization, the overpay of that versus what they're paying Pirtle right now, and they're going to have to, like you said, probably trade Pirtle because they both really are centers. I don't think you can play either of them at the 4. Mm-hmm. So at that point, I just don't know what you're doing there because you're going to probably have to trade Pirtle. And Pirtle's on a good contract, so maybe you can get some value back, but you're basically trading him as a consequence of doing this. And I just think the kind of offer you have to send Jarrett Allen's way just to get him onto the team isn't worth it when you look at, you have a player with a very similar skill set who's also very, very good at his position that you're already paying like $13 million less. So that it just doesn't make sense to me in that respect.
Okay, yeah, and I kind of agree with you. Unless there was a move to move Pirtle down the road, I don't see that why they would make that hard run at Jarrett Allen. And even though his contract projection is $23 million, well, guess what? If you're going to send an offer sheet, you probably got to give him even more than that to try to get the Cavs not to match. And then the last player who I think is actually the most realistic target for the Spurs if they go after him, and he's the most gettable because of the situation, is Lauri Markkanen. His contract projection is only $16 million, so the Spurs could pay a little bit more and see if the Bulls will match or not. All indications that Chicago might be willing to let him go. They're not as strong at bringing him back compared to Allen and Collins with their teams. So I really feel like Lauri, he fits all those things that the Spurs want. He's a big. He can start next to Pirtle. He can come off the bench. He brings you outside shooting. He can play inside. He can play in that mid range area. He can score a little bit near the basket. He's gonna have some issues on defense, obviously, but you hope that Jakob and the wings can help him out there. So yeah, I feel like Lauri, out of all these players that we discussed so far, Lauri is probably the most gettable from the Spurs if they go after him. What are your thoughts on Lauri Markkanen?
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, especially with the gettable part. When it comes to free agency and especially restricted free agency, unless there's some sort of reporting out there, it's hard to say kind of oh, I know this is absolutely going to happen. But just because it looks like John Collins is going to come off the board, and just because it looks like the Spurs are interested in Lauri Markkanen, and like the Bulls are totally okay with letting him walk, I just think that makes so much sense. I would say that like there's a better than not chance that they walk out of free agency with Lauri Markkanen this year, just because of the interest, that he's gettable, the price tag isn't as high, and he does fit basically exactly what Brian Wright was saying in terms of what they're looking for in a player. And he might have been saying that with Lauri Markkanen in mind. You know, I mean, you hear the jokes, like I think John Hollinger made a joke a couple days ago about a lot of free agency happened 3 weeks ago, you know?
Yeah.
So that could have been like hint, hint, wink, wink, we know this is already happening kind of thing. Like, it makes too much sense, especially if John Collins is off the board. I would almost kind of be shocked at this point if they don't leave free agency with one of Collins and Markkanen, and because it looks like it's not going to be Collins, I feel pretty, like, again, no sourcing or reporting. It just seems like something that's bound to happen at this point.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I just thought of two things. Like, one is, like, just remember a few years ago, they were interested when Kristaps Porzingis was with the Knicks, they were interested in going after him. The Spurs were one of those teams that wanted him. So maybe you get he's not quite at the level of Porzingis, but a player who very much fits like that type of player archetype in Lauri Markkanen. And then plus also, you can gamble with Markkanen with an offer sheet, because you can send an offer sheet to Chicago, let's say $18 million, right? $2 million more than what his projection is, and you still have enough cap space to kind of go around and look at different free agents in the meantime. Whereas, like, let's say you send a $28 million offer sheet to John Collins, well, then that gets interesting, because then your options in terms of other free agents are a little bit more limited, and who else you're pursuing as you wait those, because you got to be able to wait these 48 hours out if you do send a full offer sheet to a free agent. And so again, I think that yes, like out of these players, if I had to say which one, has the Spurs have the best chance of getting, I really think that it's Lauri Markkanen. So I think that'll be really interesting to see if maybe some rumors start to heat up as we get closer to free agency, if about their interest in him. Now, these last two players aren't necessarily free agents; they're on contracts. But these are just two players I'm looking at in the event that the Spurs did want to work on a sign and trade with DeRozan. So let's just say DeRozan and the Washington Wizards wanted to work together. Maybe DeRozan wants to go play alongside Bradley Beal next year. And there's been some reporting that yes, the Wizards are one of those teams that has interest. Well, then I think that maybe you can get some players there that kind of fit these models as well, that are bigs. Two players specifically, see if the Wizards will be unloading either one of them or both of them. Davis Bertans, obviously, the Spurs are very familiar with him. They brought him in to their organization. Maybe you can get Bertans or Kyle Kuzma, who were apparently, according to Mark Stein, before he got traded to the Wizards, the Spurs were one of the teams trying to see if the Lakers would work with them on getting Kuzma to the Spurs in the event that DeRozan wanted to go to the Lakers and they could do a sign and trade. So what are your thoughts on either of those two players in the event that DeRozan wanted to go to the Wizards and the Wizards, we're talking to Spurs?
No, I think that's interesting, because Kuzma, you're kind of doing the second draft type of thing, where he's been on the Lakers, and his first season with the Lakers was great, and then kind of it became the LeBron James experience, and he didn't quite look as good after that. I think that sometimes a change of scenery really can't help, and I actually think that works with Lauri Markkanen as well. I think depending on the role that the Spurs give him, Lauri Markkanen could look a lot better than he did in his last season in Chicago. And so I think I think that there are a lot of people who were not extremely excited to hear about the possibility of Kyle Kuzma in San Antonio. However, I think you just have to take as many shots at finding good young players as possible. And this is a shot. Is it absolutely going to work out if it were to happen? No, but it's worth happening. Now, Bertans, I'm a little bit kind of nervous just because he had a pretty rough year. And so it's hard to know if a player who had a rough year because of COVID, they'll bounce back from that. And I mean, because of COVID, both in the sense that the Wizards were really hit by it hard, but also he was pretty much out from the time that the pandemic started to the time that they started training camp. He was really out of basketball. Mm-hmm. So is he going to return to that form that he had in the 1920 season, or is what we saw kind of where he's at now? Because if that's the case, then that's not 1920 Bertans obviously would be awesome to have on the Spurs. 2021 Bertans, that's not quite as exciting of a player. But I think that just taking a shot on a young player like Kuzma, even though I know that there are a lot of fans out there who are kind of concerned with different aspects of his game, I think that at this point they just have to take as many shots as they can get.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So yeah, I mean, yeah, Spurscast is, just like we discussed there, hopefully that helped you all out in kind of knowing, that was like our primer free agency primer of, all the options the Spurs have. I think the real interesting part though, like when I really put it down on paper, was the fact that they only have so few roster spots left. Like I didn't realize that until I started really putting this roster together. It's like, wow, like, they don't have any options if they bring back some of these players. It's like 3 or 4 players that they can even add to this team. So, we'll see which way the Spurs go in free agency. It does begin officially on August 2nd is when teams can begin negotiations at 5 p.m. Central Time, and then they have to wait those 5 or 6 days for the moratorium, and then they can officially start signing contracts. But again, they can at least agree in principle to certain type of deals. If the Spurs send an offer sheet to somebody like Lauri Markkanen, well then we're going to wait 48 hours to see if the Bulls match or not, or even if it's somebody like John Collins with the Hawks. So again, we'll kind of see. Don't forget to visit ProjectSpurs.com, especially next week when free agency begins. We'll be covering that in full depth over on Project Spurs. And thanks again to Collin for joining me here on the Spurscast episode, and also to Michael DeLeon for mixing and producing this episode. From all of us at Project Spurs, stay safe and have a great day.